There are moments in a person's life that they carry forever, not because they were looking for them, not because they planned anything, but because something found them, and once it did, nothing felt quite the same afterward. This is one of those moments. And I need you to understand. What happened that morning at Ray Mill House wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary. It was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday in the Wiltshire countryside. A routine shift. A gray English sky. And then the kind of discovery that changes the way you think about loyalty, about loss, and about the things the dead leave behind for the living. Ray Mill House sits in Lacock, Wiltshire, like it was placed there by someone who wanted beauty to exist without announcement. There's no fanfare about it. No tourists queuing at iron gates. No mounted cameras broadcasting to the world. It's tucked away from the loudness of everything else, old stone, old trees, a river that doesn't care about headlines. Camilla had owned the property since long before she became queen consort. It was her private retreat, her personal corner of England. And after the late Queen Elizabeth passed in September of 2022, the property took on a different kind of weight. It became quieter in a way that wasn't just about sound. The morning I'm telling you about was in early spring. The kind of morning where the air still has frost in it, but the light looks almost warm. That trick the English countryside plays on you in March, making you feel like something is about to begin even when nothing has been announced. I wasn't on duty inside the estate itself. My post that morning was the outer perimeter, the access lane that feeds into the property from the main road. It's a long approach lined with old hedgerows, and at that hour, before the world remembers to be busy, it has a stillness to it that is genuinely hard to describe. You hear birds, you hear your own breathing, sometimes a car on a distant road. That's all. My colleague that day, I'll call him Marcus, because that's close enough, had been with the detail for about 3 years longer than me. He knew the property better than I did. Knew which gates creaked, which corner of the grounds the deer liked to cross in the morning, which window in the main house would catch the early light and shine gold for about 20 minutes before the sun shifted. He was that kind of person, noticing things quietly. We weren't expecting anything unusual. Our briefing that morning had been entirely standard. The principal was not in residence. A small domestic staff team was present. A maintenance contractor was due later in the day to look at some drainage work near the old garden wall. Otherwise, the day was supposed to be calm. It wasn't. Part 2, what Marcus noticed first. It started with something small. That's always how these things start, isn't it? Marcus was doing a sweep of the rear grounds, a routine walk that he did every 2 hours, covering the walled garden, the outbuildings, and the old storage structures at the far end of the property near what used to be, years ago, a converted coach house. It had been repurposed at some point as a secondary storage facility. Climate-controlled, locked, largely forgotten in the daily flow of the estate. He radioed me at just before 7 in the morning. His voice was calm. Marcus was always calm. That was almost annoying about him. But there was something underneath it that made me pay attention immediately. A kind of careful flatness that people use when they're trying not to say too much over an open channel. Can you come to the north outbuilding? Take the long route. Don't use the main path. I didn't ask questions. I took the long route. When I got there, he was standing about 4 feet back from a side door of the outbuilding. The door was old, thick oak, iron hinges, the kind that requires an actual physical key, not a card or a code. It was ajar. Not broken, not forced, ajar. And that was the thing. That door was always locked. I'd walked past it a dozen times in previous shifts, and it had never been anything other than firmly shut. It had that particular settled look of a door that nobody had touched in a long time. But now it was open, not wide, just slightly, the way a door swings when someone has passed through and not pulled it properly behind them. How long has it been like this? I asked him. I don't know, he said. I did this sweep 2 hours ago, and it was closed. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. We called it in immediately, proper procedure. You don't enter an unsecured structure alone, you don't close or seal a door that's been found open, and you don't assume. You report. You wait for instruction. You secure the perimeter and let the chain of command do what it exists for. But while we waited, standing in that damp morning air with the hedgerows behind us and the old stone wall to our left, Marcus looked at me and said, very quietly, "There's a smell coming from inside. Not bad, just old, like something that's been closed up for years just got air." I stepped closer. He was right. It smelled like paper and cedar and something else I couldn't name. Not unpleasant. But not like an empty storage room. Part 3, what was inside. The response team arrived within 15 minutes. A senior member of the household staff came with them. A woman I'll call Mrs. Hartley, who had been with the Duchess of Cornwall's household for over a decade before the transition, and who carried that particular kind of knowledge that comes from long institutional loyalty. She knew where things were. She knew what things meant. She took one look at the open door, and her face did something I wasn't expecting. She didn't look alarmed. She looked, and I've thought about this many times since, she looked like someone who had been told something they already half believed, like confirmation arriving. She stepped inside first with authorization. We followed. The room was larger than it looked from outside. Stone-flagged floor, low ceiling, a single window on the far wall that let in a strip of pale morning light. Along the walls, wooden shelving. And on the shelving, crates. Flat wooden crates, the kind used to transport artwork or fragile objects. Archival boxes, several leather trunks that looked genuinely old, not decoratively old, not antique aesthetic, but old. Heavy brass clasps, initials pressed into the leather on some of them. Not all of the initials were Camilla's. That was when Mrs. Hartley made a sound, not a gasp exactly, more like a breath that stopped halfway. She moved to one of the leather trunks, the largest, near the back wall, and knelt in front of it. The clasp was not locked. She opened it, and the sound of the leather lid on its hinges was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. Inside, wrapped in layers of acid-free tissue paper and lint-free cloth, were objects. I'm going to be careful here about what I say, because some of what was recovered that morning has been documented through proper channels, and I will not be the person who narrates the specifics beyond what is already part of the record. But I can tell you what I saw with my own eyes in those first few minutes. A set of photograph frames, not modern, not the kind you find in a high-street shop, but heavy silver frames with the kind of careful craftsmanship that doesn't exist anymore the way it once did. Some of them still had photographs in them, not public photographs, private ones. People at tables, in gardens, in drawing rooms, moments that were never meant to be exhibited. A collection of handwritten correspondence, folded carefully, tied in groups with pale ribbon. The ink on some of them was faded to the color of old tea. Several small decorative objects that I didn't have the knowledge to identify precisely, but that Mrs. Hartley could clearly place immediately. She picked one up, a small enameled box, blue and gold, and held it in both hands for a long moment before she said anything. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "These were hers," she said. "The late Queen's. Some of these we've been looking for some of these." Part 4, the weight of what that meant. I want to stop here for a moment and try to explain something. When someone dies, especially when someone dies who lived a life surrounded by history, by objects that carry meaning, by rooms full of things collected over 96 years, the accounting of those things doesn't always happen cleanly. It's not like a filing cabinet. It's not like a spreadsheet. Objects move. They get carried somewhere for safekeeping, and the person who knew where they were carried also dies, or forgets, or simply never writes it down because they assumed they'd always be there to remember. The late Queen Elizabeth II had lived in palaces. She had moved between residences for nearly a century. Things she had held and worn and used and loved had dispersed in ways that were orderly and ways that were simply human, given to people she trusted, stored in places that made sense at the time, accompanied by explanations that existed only in the memory of whoever gave them. Some of those objects ended up in transit during difficult periods. Some ended up in the care of people who weren't formal estate custodians, but who were trusted in a different, older kind of way. It wasn't unusual in that context for items to have made their way to Ray Mill House. Camilla had been close to the late Queen in ways that the public had perhaps not always understood, especially in the later years. There was a trust there that had been built over time, quietly, in private, the way real trust is always built. But these particular items hadn't been formally cataloged. They hadn't been in the inventory that the estate team had been working from. And in the months following the Queen's passing, there had been a quiet, careful effort to locate certain pieces that seemed to have no confirmed location. And here they were, in a stone outbuilding in Wiltshire, behind a door that someone, possibly a staff member who had since left, possibly someone acting under instruction years ago, had locked, and in the passage of time and grief and change, simply never unlocked again. The door had been found open this morning, not because of any dramatic event. The maintenance contractor, the one scheduled later for the drainage work, had apparently arrived early, used a property key obtained through the estate office, and walked through the outbuilding briefly before the main team arrived. He hadn't known what the room contained. He just left the door as he found it. But in leaving it open, he'd given Marcus something to notice. And Marcus had noticed. Part 5 after. The household team took over completely from that point. Our role became what it always should be in those circumstances: perimeter, security, discretion. We stepped back. We let the people with the right knowledge and the right authority do what they needed to do. I watched from outside as more people arrived over the next hour, carefully, quietly. There was no drama in the external sense. No scene. No press, no cameras, no raised voices. Just people doing something important in the way that important things are usually done, methodically, with care, with attention to what each moment deserved. Mrs. Hartley came out at one point and stood for a moment in the morning air. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing. The way people stand when something has settled in them and they need a moment before they carry it back inside. I didn't say anything to her. That felt right. Marcus and I finished our shift in silence mostly. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind that exists when both people have been in the same room as something significant and both of them are still sorting out what to do with it. On the drive back afterward, he said, almost to himself, not quite to me, imagine how long they'd been sitting there, just sitting there in the dark. I didn't answer because there wasn't much to add. But I've thought about it since. I've thought about those photograph frames, the handwritten letters tied with ribbon, that small enameled box that Mrs. Hartley held in both hands like something she'd been worried about for a long time. Objects that had been in the rooms of a woman who had been queen for 70 years, touched by her hands, chosen by her, kept. And then lost for a while, in the quiet disorder that follows any ending, royal or otherwise. Part 6, what stays with you? I've been asked a few times since, by people who heard something about what happened that morning, because in small professional circles things travel even when nobody is supposed to talk. I've been asked what it felt like to be there for that. Honestly, it felt like something I didn't have the right words for at the time, and I'm still not sure I do now. It wasn't exciting, not in the way people mean when they use that word. It wasn't thrilling or dramatic. It was something quieter and more complicated than that. It was the feeling of being present at the edge of something private, something that belonged to grief and memory, and the particular kind of love that expresses itself through keeping things safe. Those objects weren't just objects. They were decisions. Every one of them had been wrapped and placed and left somewhere by someone who cared about what they were. That act of care doesn't stop meaning something just because the person who did it is gone. What I saw that morning was a small piece of what it looks like when someone is loved and remembered. Not publicly, not with ceremony, just in the ordinary, imperfect way that real people actually do it. And if a slightly open door on a cold March morning was what it took to bring any of that back where it belonged, well, there are worse ways for things to find their way home.